Today's video is going to cover a few simple questions of whether or not you should buy a table saw. Now, for the purpose of this video, a table saw will refer to a job site saw, as this is going to be the entry saw for most people. If you can afford a cabinet saw as your first table saw, have at it, they're great. But for 99.9% of people, it's going to be a job site saw. So when I'm asking these questions, we're going to be referring to this type of saw and this size of saw specifically. Question number one, and arguably the most important question. Do you wish to alter the length and the width of a piece of wood of any type? If the answer is yes, there are multiple options, but this is definitely a main reason to consider buying a table saw. If no, you probably aren't going to buy a table saw. That's kind of what it does. So that would be a do not buy if you have no interest in doing this at all. Now, the main competing alternatives to a table saw are things like a circular saw with a guide, a track saw, a jigsaw sort of, and of course doing it by hand. This doesn't involve doing it by hand at all. That's a totally different question as to whether you want to do that. But let's consider some things that the table saw is particularly good at that something like a track saw isn't great at. First, let's start with small things. You are not going to be able to cut these with a track saw or a circular saw. If you want to make this into a ton of these, that's table saw. Even ripping, as in changing the width of a piece of wood, this size is going to be much easier on the table saw than on a track saw. There just isn't a lot of reference surface to put the track. Now, a circular saw with an edge guide could certainly do this, but it's not going to be anywhere near as accurate. So if you're thinking of working with pieces that are not large sheet goods and things like that, and you want to change the length and the width, a table saw is going to be a very good option. Question number two, are you more comfortable or would you just generally prefer to move the tool itself or the material, the lumber, through the tool? This is kind of the fundamental difference. With anything other than a table saw, you have to move the saw yourself. With the table saw, you manipulate the wood. I personally much prefer to manipulate the wood. It's lighter, it's more stable in my opinion on a table saw for a lot of different types of cuts to manipulate the wood rather than the tool. That doesn't mean the table saw can replace everything else. But if you prefer to move the wood through the tool, buy the table saw, or at least consider it. If you don't care or you don't want to do that, then the table saw is not ideal for you because it's all about moving the material through the blade itself, which is one of the giant upsides of a table saw versus a track saw or a circular saw. Now, we touched on this a bit before, but question number three is, do you want to work with small parts? This is a fundamentally important question when deciding between a table saw or something like a circular saw or track saw. Obviously, hand saws are great for small parts too. But for instance, I make a lot of my own dowels, and so I have to cut a ton of these kind of dowel blanks, let's call it that. This just isn't something I can quickly and easily do with a circular saw or track saw. The ability to whip all of these out very quickly, that's a table saw procedure. Even something this size, I don't know what this is, 8x8, maybe something like that, not going to be very easy to do with a track saw or circular saw because your reference to be able to hold it and clamp it and place it, there's not a lot there. Also, very thin pieces. The weight of a track saw may not be able to hold up well on something that's 1/8 of an inch thick, but I can easily rip this or cut this down to length however I want on the table saw. So if you envision working with anything small, and by small, it doesn't even have to be that small. We can just be talking about something that's 16 inches, 14 inches long. The table saw is going to probably be the right option for you versus a track saw or a circular saw. If you are not intending to work with anything small, if you're just doing large sheet goods, then it's not a good reason to buy a table saw, though I prefer to cut my sheet goods on the table saw as well in most cases. Question number four, how important is accuracy and repeatability? As I said before, I make a ton of my own dowels. I need these to all be the same size and I need to do it over and over. I have another project here which required, 12 of the same pieces to be the same size, the same length, etc. That's a table saw project for me. Even something larger. If I had to cut 8, 10, 12 of these down to a specific width, table saw all day, you can set the fence, lock it in, and it allows absolute repeat accuracy over and over. Now, the level of accuracy is going to increase with the cost of the table saw, unfortunately. But on job site saws, you can do real good if you spend the time to set it up right. Even with things like composite materials and sheet goods, I still like the repeatability and accuracy of the table saw versus having to move the track saw. Now, places like Craig, they do sell some kind of setups for track saws to give repeatability. but you're starting to get up into the cost of a decent job site saw anyways at that point. So even for me, for sheet goods, repeatability, accuracy, if that matters to you, a table saw is probably going to be a buy. If you don't care about that, then I guess that's not a good reason to buy, though I think it's probably good to care about accuracy and repeatability. Up next, we have the question of space, your workspace specifically, and your storage space. What are you working with? My job site saw, I just gave a quick measurement. It's about floor space, kind of footprint. We're looking at 60 inches by 40 inches unfolded. It folds up into a storable manner that's smaller than that. But if you're going to use it with the legs out, you've got to have at minimum that just to put it there. Then you need room to manipulate yourself around it. This is a place where the track saw and the circular saw absolutely win out. They're much easier to store. You can manipulate them much more easily in terms of space and where you want to do something. If you do not have space, the table saw is going to be a tricky one for you, though there are smaller job site saws even that you can literally put on a bench somewhere and work with that. If space is an issue for you, you're going to have to really consider whether any of the even smaller ones can fit, but it's probably a don't buy if you have really no working space. If you do have space, have at it. You can get as big of one as you want. That's not a concern for you at all. Question 6, what is your budget? Now this is a question with every tool, but there are tiers of table saws even within the job site saw kind of realm. I started out with the Ryobi. I don't know if it was like $200 or something at the time new. I hated it, but it got me into woodworking and I did so much with it. But looking back on it, it was so frustrating. Now, to get a decent saw new, you're looking at probably $300 to $500, maybe $600 for the good job site saws. Anything used is going to be a little different. There's a lot of contractor saws out there from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s on Facebook Marketplace, like Delta ones and Jet ones that are really good saws. But if you're only working with like $150 or something like that, depending upon your location, it may be better to go for now without either buying either of them and saving your money, or with a decent used circular saw and track guide. Track saws, unfortunately, are also quite expensive, though I don't have much experience with the low-end ones. So if you have the budget for a decent track saw, you have the budget for a decent job site table saw. So consider buying that. And like I said, if you're not working with much money, probably not the right time to buy the table saw. I don't want to say this is a one and done purchase because obviously I myself scaled up. But if you buy a decent job site saw to start, you're not going to want to buy another job site saw. It's only going to be after that, if you have a lot of space, that you're going to move up into the contractor or cabinet saw. So make sure the budget is right and it matches what you are able to buy and want to buy at the time. Up next comes the question of portability. And this is going to be specifically comparing and contrasting to a circular saw with a guide or a track saw. Those two latter things, the circular saw and the track saw, are supremely mobile. You can carry them with one hand very easily. You can store them in a small space in a car. They are meant to be easily moved and stored. Job site saws, as the name says, are meant to be taken to the job site. They are absolutely portable, but it's nowhere near as easy. I think my DeWalt probably weighs, 100 pounds, maybe a little more. And that's not the key issue. The key issue is it's awkward in size to pick up. It has wheels on it, and a lot of job site saws do. Once it's on the ground, super easy to move the thing around, get it into tight spaces. It's designed for that. But if I had to take my saw somewhere every day, and especially if I had like a sedan or something like that, I'm not choosing the table saw. I'm choosing the track saw in most cases, unless the track saw simply cannot do what I need the table saw I buy to do. So if portability is not an issue or only a very small issue, certainly consider the table saw. If it's an absolutely supreme issue for you, or if you don't have a great way to carry a table saw in like a trunk or something like that, you're probably going to want to go with the track saw or the circular saw or hand tools. Our final question here on this relatively basic list involves noise and dust. Job site saws are loud and they produce a lot of dust, even with okay or decent dust collection vacuum systems. If you are okay with noise and with dust in an area like a garage or a workshop, go ahead, you can buy the table saw, no big deal. If you can't make much noise, this is a big no-no for you. If you can't make much dust, this is also a big no-no for you because, like I said, even with pretty good shop vac kind of dust collection, they still throw dust up in the air from when the blade is coming through. And they're loud. Job site saws are really loud compared to cabinet saws and whatnot. So just consider this, your space. Are you working out of a home garage with a young child? It's going to be loud. It may wake them up. Things like that to consider ahead of time. as to whether or not you can put the job site saw in a space that allows for noise and dust. That's going to do it for us today. I'm trying to keep these relatively short and relatively simple. There are numerous other reasons to consider whether or not to buy a table saw. But if you answered yes to multiple of these, it's probably a good time to buy a table saw, or it's something you should consider buying. If most of your answers were no, the table saw probably isn't something you really want or need at this point. Something like a track saw or hand tools or a circular saw may be better for you. Well, thank you for joining me today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, put them down below. If you have any other reasons as to why someone may buy a table saw or may not want to buy a table saw, leave them down there too. There are, like I said, numerous things I'm leaving out here for the sake of brevity, but I think those are the core things to consider as to whether or not to buy a table saw. So hopefully this helped you out today. And the last thing I want to add is that table saws, there is a level of danger to them. It's a spinning fast blade, but that's something you have to consider with every type of saw that's powered by a motor. All right, have a good one. Bye.